When you're ready, Margaret.
Right.
Yeah.
My name's Margaret Dallow, and this is the 4th of October, and I live in Frog Lane in Bromyard, but I've lived in Herefordshire all my life.
Okay. Tell me about your mother's stories you were telling me before.
My mother's stories really is the first of my memories of hop picking, when she said that the Pankhurst sisters came down into the hop yard at Bishop's Room to talk to the women there. And also living in my family home was a nun and she came every hop picking, and she came down into the hop yards to save the souls of the hop pickers.
A bit more about the Pankhurst.
Yeah. Just you tell us any more about the Pankhurst. I'm sure you said her name was Sylvia.
Sylvia Pankhurst. I'm afraid I can't. That's just a brief. My mother used to come out with these things and her little snippets of her memories, which stayed with me. But I can't tell you any more than that the Pankhurst did come to the hop yards in Bishop's Room.
So you grew up on the hop farm?
Yes, we spent several years on a hop farm at Yark Hill, and this is when we were just going out on a big scale of picking hops in the cribs, and we used to have 200 hop pickers and 100 children from the Welsh valleys, and they came in cattle lorries. There was one with the people in and one with the luggage in, which fetched them to Yark Hill, to Garford Farm. And we also had about 100 gypsies there. And the gypsies, we had a long drive from the road right down to the farmhouse, and all down the one field were these green square tents that had pretty coloured material hanging inside, hundreds of dogs, and the head of them all was a very, very strong lady, and she kept them in check. And they knew that my father ran the local football club, and so they used to protect my mother, my sister and I by walking round the farmhouse at night to see that we were all right. And they did, if they got to fighting, there was a big pool, and sometimes somebody fell in the pool, and Father used to have to put their caravan or tent down the other end of the farm. It was usually over a woman. And but they got along with the rest of us, and the Welsh people, on a Sunday night, they sang Welsh hymns, and this memory has stayed with me. I love a Welsh choir, and we used to clean out the cattle shed so that they could all come in there and sing their hymns, and that was a lovely sound. They just lived in barracks, as we used to call it, and the head lady, there were some very strong women about in that time, because there was a lady who brought them from the valleys, and she had the best one. And they were whitewashed out, and there was like straw put for them to put their rugs over for them to lie on. And they used to have charabangs that came on Sunday, and Father had to see that they didn't take all the apples and all the potatoes, but he made sure that they had a fair share of potatoes and apples to go back to the valleys with on a Sunday. The gypsies used to come with their horses, and they used to trade from the farm. They never said how many horses they were. And we as girls, my sister and I, used to look out through the window, and there would be 40, 50, how many, we never knew, of the piebald or skewbald horses in the field. And then overnight they'd disappear completely, and you wouldn't know where they went. And we didn't as children hear them. We slept in the other end of this big farmhouse. But they'd disappear overnight, and there would be no horses in the field the next morning.
So then tell me about the trotting races.
Ah, well, that's my mother's memories again. She used to tell me that they used to have trotting races at Bishop's Room, the road that goes along by the Green Dragon towards Burley Gate. There's a straight bit along there where they used to trot the horses.
bushler being beaten up?
Oh yes, this is another of my mother's memories. She used to tell me about the bushler because the women would go on strike. Even in my memory, the women would go on strike if they weren't paid enough money, as they thought, and they would stop picking, you see. And my mother's had wonderful memory. She told me that they, at Froomes Hill, she actually told me it was at Froomes Hill that they did beat up the bushler because the bushler had to be a very firm man to deal with mainly women who were there really to feed their children and get clothes for the winter, shoes. That was the time that they could go out and earn money. And, this is a story of my mother's, that she said that they really beat him up and because he wasn't playing fair. And the bushler had to be very careful how he bushelled from one crib to another. If he was very bushling light, as they said, he'd only put a little bit in. If he liked the woman, he'd only put a little bit in and say one. Well, at the next one, he'd fill the basket right up to the top. And the women soon would notice this. And they would get round him, but he was never in conversation. He never got in conversation with anybody. He had to be strong as well. And I can see my father bushling now, and they used to say, come on, Bill. Come on, Bill. And you had to be strong enough to be fair to the women. I mean, they were only there to, as I said, improve their family, get shoes for the children and school clothes and things like that.
So tell us about the mandolin. Do you want Margaret to hold the mandolin?
Yes, that would be.
Would that be possible, Margaret?
Yeah.
But you need to sit down.
Yeah, I'll sit down.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
One of my favourite stories about the hop picking season is my father came home one night with this mandolin, and he'd given a gypsy some money so that he could buy some food for the children. Or that was his story. And so it's been in our family for about 60 years. And I have this wonderful picture of gypsy girls dancing round a fire while he played the mandolin. Well, mainly riots and strikes that went on. It was mainly over the money, and if the bushler was favouring one woman over another, then they would get argumentative, the women, and they would go on strike. They would go on strike. I remember when I was on this hop farm at York Hill, they all went on strike. For more money because they felt they weren't being fairly played.
And how was that resolved?
Well, I think they had to. Father had to go and talk to the man that owned the farm, and another memory I've got of the farm, that they used to sub the money. They used to queue up at the window. And often by the end of the week, there wasn't any money for them to be paid. They'd want payment on what they'd earned for the day. They'd come, and we had a window in an office on the side of this big farmhouse, and they used to queue up, some of them, the men usually, to go to the pub. And so by the time the end of the week came, there wasn't any money for them. This is one of my poems called Songs and Charabangs, and it's for when I lived on a farm at York Hill. Songs and Charabangs. The yard was cleaned out where the cattle had wintered, barracks whitewashed, all must be ready. The hop pickers were coming from down in the valleys. 200 souls brought here in the lorries, another followed behind with all of their baggage. 96 children, their only holiday, Black tips of coal make up their mountains. Songs and charabancs are my memories. Busloads of visitors arrived on a Sunday, potatoes and apples stuffed in a bag, father checking no more than their quota. Strains of hymns ring out through the rafters down that long drive to the farm called Garford. This poem is about the hop dryer. We always in the farmhouse had to feed the hop dryer, and he'd come in dirty and oil-looking hands, stained hands. He never slept properly for all the time that he was drying the hops. It's called the hop dryer. The night hangs heavy with the sulphur fumes. The evening mist gathered down in the valley. Drying the hops has begun. Sacks brought to the kiln, picked and leafed in an ancient crib, piled high on the lofty green stage. Now carefully spread sack by sack on the kiln's Hessian floor, to be dried by oil or coal. The man in charge is called the dryer. He's the man who holds the key to whether the crops succeed or fall. 2 loads a day, he never sleeps, 8 hours a time, the hops are cooked. Then you wait for the load to come back, a phrase the farmer used. Cooled and coddled, finally crushed under pressure into the giant pockets, proudly stamped with the farmer's name. We lived and breathed hops here in the Froome Valley. It was our life, our heritage. It simply consolidated village life. It's all but gone, an old man's memories now. Will our children ever know the feeling of a community pulling together? There was a whole family in Bishopsfroome that did the wire work for the area, and their names were Watkins, and the father was a very clever man, because it was all about weight and strength, and because if you had a hop yard go down, that was your season's work and all your money lost. So if Ned Watkins put up a hop yard, then you knew you would be all right. And the local headmaster used to help him work out the maths, because it's all about maths, a hop yard is. And so that he was quite famous in this area for his wire work.
Do you think it's a good thing or bad thing? Could you
Yes,
tell the camera?
I think
To Marshall is
Or to me, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I think recording the oral history of Herefordshire about hop picking and other things that took place in this wonderful county of ours is very important, because it'll be lost. I feel when I'm gone, who will tell my mother's stories of the Pankhursts coming to Bishopsfroome and things like that? Cap on the back of his head and his sleeves rolled up, and he'd be in that charabanc saying, "You can't take all those," and pushing it back on so that they didn't strip the farm of all the produce. Yes, I have memories of my father, a tall man he was, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and a cap on the back of his head, and he used to be on the charabanc sorting out to see that they didn't take all the produce off the farm, pulling the bags out from up above their heads and sorting how many apples were in that and how many potatoes were in that bag. And that was his job on a Sunday night before they went back down into Wales, into the valleys. In my family home at Bishopsfroome, there was a large room which rarely used by the family, that was where the nun lived for the duration of the hop picking, sometimes 6 weeks. There was a little door in the one corner where she could pop out to the outside toilet, and there she lived with the family for the time of the hop picking. She left behind, and it's a prized possession of my sister's, a little organ that could be folded up and carried like a very large suitcase down into the hop yard and she would sing hymns. And of course, people liked to sing, and they would join in with the hymns. One of my earliest memories of life in Herefordshire was that my father worked on a large farm, and he didn't go to war, but he had lots of prisoners of war working on the farm. And the Germans, he used to, 3 or 4 of them, he would bring them home to tea. And they would make presents for my mother, and they make presents for my sister and I, a kaleidoscope, handbags, purses, and they didn't really believe what was going on. They said it was all propaganda, and they didn't believe of Auschwitz and that. And he received one letter from the one that was the schoolmaster at the end of the war, and he just wrote, "It wasn't all propaganda, Bill."